Joining me today on this SIP number 71 is Dr. Scott E. Daniels. He is the professor of the history of political philosophy at Liberty University. He's the former Deputy Secretary of Health and Human Resources of Virginia, and he has served in policy roles under 4 U.S. presidents. And today we're unpacking the 4 core principles of civic republicanism. This is what the founders believed were essential for a free republic, from the role of religion and personal virtue to liberty as freedom from domination, and not to leave out the common good. These ideas powered the Declaration of Independence and the Pledge of Allegiance. But in 2026, are they still relevant? Or have we completely lost the plot? Let's find out. So welcome, Scott. I've been meaning to get with you and talk about this idea of the founding principles and whether they're relevant. And I've seen this recur over time. I think it happened in 2015 with Mayor Cuomo in New York. On my show, SIP number 62, I talked to Thor Christos about Ted Cruz schooling Tim Kaine about where our power comes from.
Right.
Recently had the same ridiculous situation occur again on CNN, commenting on the rededication ceremony from the mall, where Speaker Johnson, gave clear statement as to where our power comes from. It's a totally alien concept. Clearly they haven't. I'm sure they would refuse to read something so atrociously fascist as the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah, I know.
God. So really, it's an idea, it's a principle, and it's not the only one, but yeah, it's probably the core thing that our power as individuals is granted by God. It's inalienable, as the phrase goes. But there's more to it.
Yes.
And you have an expert, well, obviously educated opinion, but you have qualifications with which to discuss these things. And I was looking at a presentation you did about the relevancy of the founding principles.
Yes.
And so I prepared a pile of questions.
Good.
And we don't always get to the questions in the way that we think we will. But there was one I was interested in knowing more about, because I think you go over it in your presentation.
Yes.
About a personal story you had when you were in Nebraska as an undergrad student.
Yeah.
You were doing a crusade program, started with 6 students, ended up with over 100.
That's right.
And so that must have had an impact on some of how your career and thinking went. Is that true?
No, it is. I think that in that particular moment, at that particular time, more than anything, a fundamental conviction as a believer in Christ Jesus. But that sort of zeal, energy would carry on to pretty much even to this day in things that I do. But, you just totally commit to set a goal that you think is realistic and clear enough, and other people can latch onto it. And then in terms of a servant leader, you just begin to cut the way, and people begin to follow, because they think, hey, he's not asking me to do anything more than what he is doing. And that's what we did on the campus. Now, obviously, in addition to that, there's content. In the case of the movement, when I was in college, it was evangelical, Christian, biblically oriented, that sort of thing. Whereas today, where I've been involved in the Republican Party in Henrico County, when I was 3-chop magisterial chair, it was the core principles of the Republican Party, largely. The conviction there is I understood those, and as I give emphasis to those, and the turnout, the vote was sort of secondary to the cause, and I'm motivated very strongly by cause.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's interesting for me. I had a rough, messed up evangelical kind of upbringing. Ended up being in a classic state of divorce and loss of faith, and of all great ironies, it was me exploring the Tea Party and then understanding more about how the Republican Party worked, and all the stuff I missed in school, either whether they taught it or not. I certainly missed it. So I think blame is on both sides, how
Yeah, yeah,
poorly those things were done in civics classes and idiot kids that can't connect things to what matters. But the irony is that when you start looking at some of the documents, the Center for Self-Governance has an excellent program that I was lucky enough to discover and went through. It's almost been the stupidest thing, in my opinion, is that I have a renewed appreciation for the critical involvement of Judeo-Christian teaching and values
right.
that I found through politics,
Yeah.
which is like, I didn't expect for that to be the case. It's like, oh, you understand the value of it, being think you're so far and removed and divorced from it.
One point of clarification I think that might be helpful too is um, Christianity, of course, the Judeo-Christian West, beginning largely with Christianity, but then as we enter the Renaissance period, the Jewish component entering very strongly in terms of federalism and stuff. There is that body of doctrine, a theoretical framework that sort of fills the air we breathe, the culture, the atmosphere of thought and thinking. And that would be, I would say, was permeating the minds of the founding fathers, despite the fact that their personal convictions, there might be more deistic, or less of a personal God. So the whole point about Christianity is there is this body of doctrine and theory, but then the main point is that what you hear sometimes people saying born again is the personal commitment to a personal God. So it is possible in Western society that people could latch onto the theoretical doctrine and perpetuate some of those ideas and concepts through language. I have a bizarre term that refer to that type of person is sort of the Christian atheist. You have a lot of those. Those are people that don't personally connect to a personal God, but they embrace the ethics of that particular frame of reference. I think Thomas Jefferson might be a case in point, where he embraced, sort of the general Christian ethic, but probably not. At least that as far as I know and what we know about him, was not necessarily convinced of a conviction or commitment to a personal God.
So there was a particular, maybe not founder, but influencer, George Whitefield.
Yes.
Did a lot. He was an amazing orator. You could hear him in the next town, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
And he would and you're the professor. I'm
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
recaller.
Yeah.
Apparently the notion of a personal relationship with God was kind of a new thing. When you heard him talk about it, am I remembering something accurate? Or
Well, I think what you're referring to in the case of Whitefield is sort of the Second Great Awakening, which was going to occur just ahead of the Revolution. You might be interested to know that in part of that period of time, he will pass through Virginia. It looks to me like King's Highway over by Hanover. Might even stopped at Hanover Tavern. He was an Anglican. Probably Patrick Henry would have been a young man. His father would have been sort of the caretaker of the tavern. But yeah, Whitefield, and the distinctive feature apparently, and I learned this, there's a movie that's sort of come out and it kind of intrigued, and I began to do some looking into this, but he had developed a friendship with Benjamin Franklin. And even though Whitefield was kind of in Georgia, he was moving from sort of the South all the way up to Massachusetts. His preaching had greater effect outside of those places where there were more Anglican churches. He himself was an Anglican, but right. Anglicans are more this natural law, rational, and he was more. In his expression would be more charismatic in certain respects, still orthodox and everything like that. So the appeal and the large gatherings would be, not so much in Virginia, but in other places in the colonies at the time. But he was a very dynamic figure. And, he had his complications, just like every everybody has complications. Christians are not. He was still engaged in sort of slavery, even though he articulated that he wanted to be abolitionist, but he still had slaves involved in his orphanage. And that piece, I loved the movie that I saw with
It wasn't
Franklin.
Wilberforce, was it?
No, Wilberforce is an earlier period.
Earlier period. Oh, okay.
Now he's very significant. If we just you raise his name to put him in context, we're going to go back probably actually following this period, more like the late 18th century, early 19th century. He's going to be the Anglican that's very critical in eliminating slave trade by 1805 in England.
Right.
Which will have its effect in the United States. And then by 1830, the abolition of slavery entirely. What's important about all this is that the slave trade actually originated through black tribes in Africa. And there was a triangle.
It's as new and as startling to hear that to some as the notion that our power comes from God, not from government.
And these guys are focused on that,
Yeah. So we're our focus is on the principles, and so as I understand it, reviewing your lecture that you shared with me, that there are 4 principles of civic republicanism. Now, it's almost like, I mean, during the gerrymandering or the referendum election we just went through, it was repeated to me more than once. Like, well, people don't know what gerrymandering is. They were struggling for a message, right?
Right.
And so it's more like, well, step up and learn the vernacular, please.
Right.
Because these things mean things, right?
They do.
So this question is, what are the 4 core principles of civic republicanism?
Yes.
They were embraced by the founders, but that term civic republicanism doesn't really sound like a 21st century slang lingo YouTube kind of phrase.
It isn't. And I was pulled in because one of the courses that I teach or have taught for a number of years at Liberty University is history of political philosophy. And so I look back from Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, bring it 2,500 years forward. The idea of republic was very prominent in that ancient world. And the sort of the basic point, and I'll get to the 4, is that it's anything but a monarchy. So that in ancient Rome, you did have the Emperor Caesar, right? But you had the Senate. And the Senate said, if you've ever been to Rome, and visit the Roman Forum, there is you're down between the hills with the palace on the upper left and the Senate in front, and there's the Forum officially where the people would speak to their to one another, but to their leaders. And of course, the bottom line of that story is Caesar the Senate building will burn. They're holding office inside the city of Rome. Caesar will depart to go to that home of that senator. That's where he'll be assassinated. And the reason why he's assassinated is because he was going to abolish the Senate. He was going to take over complete power. And the Republic philosophy was always that people and the citizens, they would be defined different ways at different times, would be in control. So if you fast forward, that was sort of the basics. And I thought to myself, yeah, but that doesn't help me so much. I like that. That's nice for the first, go at it to get my mind around the concept. But it wasn't, I began to wonder, is there anything distinct about American republicanism? And here's where I think about the Pledge of Allegiance to the United States.
Yes.
We pledge allegiance to the flag, United States of America, and to the republic for which it
stands. Yeah.
Now, what's significant about the pledge is it has 2 prepositional phrases with the preposition to, and that's very important because it distinguishes 2 different things. So you have the allegiance to a symbol, the flag, capturing that history, because this is written 1892. To the republic is the political order.
Right.
Now the question becomes, is that the same as democracy? And if so, are they different, and in what way? And when we pledge allegiance to the republic, was there anything distinct? And that's what led me into beginning to do the research, knowing that we're in the 250th year of the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. I thought, you know what, I should get a better handle of what this concept means, and bring it to my students. So the four principles that I have here, the founding, are actually distinct, if not unique, to Americans forming republicanism. So those are a sense of religion as providing a moral foundation. And I don't mean to undercut that the different founders may have had a diversity of intellectual belief about their particular conception of God.
Right.
There were some, I don't know exactly how great a number, 7 or 8, that were clearly evangelical in the sense that I would recognize that. An emphasis on the Bible, inerrancy of the Bible, the inspiration, that type of thing. Then there were some that were more deistic, in the sense that there is this God, he creates this world, but his involvement in the world, they would differ on. And some would say no involvement, and some would say some, but nothing in the sense that was the type of thing that I, as an evangelical, say, hey, this country was purely an evangelical in its founding. And I don't think that was but there was an influence there. I mean, and so these things have to be balanced and weighed. But what's important is, what was that sort of Christian, broadly speaking, philosophical understanding? There was this sort of theistic God that was all powerful, benevolent. There was a providence. It was of a general nature. But the specific sort of providential involvement that, I would sort of hold, that there's this personal relation, is something that some of them may not have actually held, at least at the beginning of the revolution. Later on, towards the end of their life, things could change, because that was a pretty big miracle in of itself to be able to complete that revolution. So that's one. And they weren't pluralists. They actually thought that this God, this was the true being. They were debating, if I may, a footnote on this. They were aware of the Ottoman Empire and the Islamic belief, and they were very critical of it. Right.
Good.
Now, yes, and so that's a very interesting topic into itself, because they were aware of it. They would talk about it. Now, the critics, when I bring this up, will say, "Yeah, I know, but it was only maybe 3 or 4." Got it. I understand that. But the thing is, they're having their conversations generally amongst themselves and as a group, and so it's not like that was a foreign idea. And they saw it as tyranny, because they saw this sort of theocracy, and they're doing it at the same time they're thinking about religious liberty, and they're knowing that they don't want that. But that doesn't mean that there isn't some sense a Christian nation, if we define what we mean by that, not what the progressive would be using slamming day, but a general realization that the worldview, forget the personal commitments, the worldview is heavily informed by natural law, which could be traceable to sort of classical philosophical roots, but also to Christian natural law, Thomas Aquinas, and a whole 300-400 years prior to that. You see both those influences. And when you come to the declaration that you mentioned earlier on, close on this particular point of the 4, but you have 4 references to the existence of God. You have the divine being as a creator, as a judge, as nature's God, the author of it, the supreme judge, and divine providence. These are names, and if you look at these and how they are used in a textual way, conceptual way, yes, there's fingerprints that they could have come, say, from the philosophy of John Locke, but there's a whole lot of more fingerprints. Nature's God is tying into eternal law. That was something that would be Christian and not so much Locke at the time he's writing.
One of the simplistic ways that, and you can tell me if it's too simple, when it comes down to the divine origin of power, free will. If you're going to form a self-governing republic, what better way? And I think the term you used was moral foundation.
Yes,
but in a more granular way, it's like, if you're going to be a self-governing people, how about you self-govern the individual first?
And they recognize that, and that's where the idea of the civic virtue comes into play. Now, in the ancient world, civic virtue meant civic society, civitas, and it was certain characteristic behaviors that you would have towards their nation state, okay, in terms of keeping that state in existence. The same would be kind of true here with the American founding. The idea that people had a particularly distinct now in terms of republicanism versus, say, liberalism, which is parallel to. You see those intellectual trends running side by side in this period.
Yeah.
But the one distinguishing feature is that the ideas of liberty are different in Republican liberty versus liberal. But more important at this moment, we'll get to liberty in a second, but is the idea that there is a duty to participate in the governance. It's not that the government will protect you. It is the way you protect yourself and self-government is to participate. And through that participation, you get to shape the government that's going to turn around and govern you. So the way you protect your liberties is to participate in government.
Sure. Yeah. So there's this book that I came across, Thomas Sowell's Conflict of Visions, right? And he talks about the restricted and the unrestricted. And of course, when you see that initially, you're going, well, I don't want to be restricted. And yet that is the preferred one, because if you actually improve yourself and realize you are flawed and imperfect, you're looking at yourself in a restricted fashion. But if you self-improve, you contribute to society, much in the way you just described.
Yes.
The liberal view is upside down. It's like, well, if you fix society, then you can fix the man. And we've seen that fail continuously.
Well, what was happening is the question becomes, and this is debated. I mean, you can read this. These people are debating this. Is virtue going to be enough? You remember after the Second Continental Congress, the story of Franklin leaving the hall there in Philadelphia and was asked, what did you do today? And he said, Madam, we created a republic if you can keep it. That underscores the fragility of a republic. And he probably leaned even more heavier towards virtue being the inner workings being and their connection and participation in government as being what's really critical to keeping the republic alive and protected. But other founders here in our home of Virginia, Madison, for example, he didn't neglect virtue, but he thought there had to be some institutional constraints because this self-interest within the individual is so strong. Our big fat ego. We will abuse the power that we might have. What's interesting with Madison is he's studying with a person by the name of Witherspoon at the College of New Jersey, which is today modern is Princeton University. And he's studying with Witherspoon, who is bringing over the ethical theories coming out of the Scottish Enlightenment and a Christian Protestant Presbyterian by the name of Francis Hutcheson. And it was a form of natural theology. There are sort of two, natural law and moral sense. And Witherspoon was this moral sense that we have innately this sort of thing. Jefferson is, despite the fact that Locke is the one that we think of inalienable rights mentioned in the Declaration, that concept was never used by Locke. If you read his second treatise, you won't find it. You find it in the ethical writings of Francis Hutcheson coming out of that sort of idea of the Scottish Enlightenment, which is much more friendlier to religious belief than, say, the Enlightenment period itself. So that's in coming into Madison. What Madison picks up is this corruption within the human being. So almost this Calvinistic sense that we're totally depraved. Yes, we can still reason, but we are really, really self-focused.
So it's interesting that you had that Scottish ideology influence, because Thomas Sowell also wrote a book called, I'm going to botch the title.
That's okay.
It's not like, redneck lies and black myths. That's not the title. I'll go ahead and put the title on the screen here just so I get it right. But
just paraphrase it.
He traces the redneck stuff, where you challenge anybody that's successful and they better get in line, and there's always violence and power struggles, not to where you may suspect or believe where it may be evident now culturally. He traces it back to the Scots,
Yeah, yeah,
the tribalism in Scotland, and so it's what a great dichotomy.
yeah,
But
yeah.
we were talking earlier about the four principles, and I
We've
think
covered two.
we got so just to reiterate, so this is civic republicanism, and
Yes.
the four principles are personal virtue. Is that the best way to reference that?
Religious founding is
Religious founding,
the morality and the sense of virtue is necessary to the republic. Civic virtue.
civic
The
virtue.
third we haven't mentioned yet is going to
Okay,
be the concept of liberty, non-domination. This is important, and we'll contrast that with non-interference, the more libertarian. Now, I don't mean to say that that libertarian theme isn't, we can't see it, but in this period of time, leading into the Declaration, the Revolution, and moving into the Constitution in 1787 and in that period, republicanism is thriving, and that idea of liberty, of non-dominance, is very prominent, and you can see it the way they're talking about it, and that gets to the issue that. Let me come back. That the fourth is going to be the common good, or the shared
right.
purposes, and those shape our four in the way that the other people might have had those four, but the way the founders put content to those four is what makes it a distinctive. But jumping back to
Well, before you do that,
yeah,
every one of these four have room for personal interpretation
yeah,
and coloring of thought. Like what the common good is to me. Well, I'm sure we're going to have arguments with others who see common good as well. Look at the way the state we're currently in the state of Virginia, not in a good state, with abhorrent governing principles. They promised common good, they didn't, and aren't, and can't deliver it. So there's an argument about what common good is, what personal, a virtuous citizen, what morality is, what freedom and what liberty is. There is a dance sheet, let's say, or a reference point that the founders left us. But then there's ignorance of it, there's contempt for it, there's arguments about it, even still, right? And I think that's
yeah,
largely deliberate.
yeah, yeah.
So you have a view,
Hmm.
which is basically a recording secretary's view of what the founders have established, right?
Yeah,
And
they would have seen the common good as the protection of the liberty, of fostering the virtue. And even though after that decade in there, the 11, 12 years, the idea of virtue is sort of, people are skeptical of it. And they're thinking we need more institutional protections, checks and balances, things that Madison will bring in the Constitution, in addition to virtue, to prevent our selfishness from taking over. We need institutional protections as well as the individual. The individual virtue never goes away. That was protecting that was what the common good is, contrasted with the way people use the term today in political debate.
well, every time they say, well, we have to put public safety first.
They have something now.
Really?
They have in mind when they use that is sort of these material conditions for what it would be in a 21st century American society, and yes, but that's not what the founders. The founders didn't have that. It's not they didn't care about that sort of stuff at that. But banking, they were trying to pay for the military that had been wounded, and they were trying to come up with the money, and they were struggling with that. Was one of their big things, getting trade going. A big debate that will cause a split between Hamilton and Madison is whether there'd be a national bank, and whether you would bring in the private aristocratic class who had the money into government to sort of create a kind of a banking system that could pay for the American bills. You have to realize. I think at the time they were probably $10 million in debt.
Yeah.
This was a terrible thing.
I mean, they're pledging their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor.
Yeah.
All that remains at the end of that one is sacred honor.
Yeah.
The lives and the fortunes you cannot count on.
So they're dealing with different issues, but today, no, it's a frivolous meaning that, Medicare, nobody's going to neglect that, but how we build the institution, those get deeper and more philosophical. And yeah, we want safety, but why do we want safety, and what kind of safety, and how are we going to protect that? And the idea that we do want it, it gets back to the idea of order. That gets back to the Republican idea of liberty, of non-dominance, which is trying to preserve our freedom through order. And it's not just the tyranny of the state they're concerned about, that to be sure, but you can have tyranny of minorities, of groups. In the private sector. And Madison is concerned about those two forms of tyranny. One would be the hard tyranny, the government. The other is more or less a soft tyranny, factions and people forming. And from my perspective, if I were to apply this, I'd say we just came through that with, in all honesty, when the Biden period, in that you felt like every word was justice was turned upside down. You have this idea of lawfare. You feel almost like there's something like a color revolution underway in this country, not from the top down, that type of tyranny, but from the bottom up, and people, scaring people like we saw in Monument Avenue, sort of a reign of terror, where they can do whatever they want, and if you oppose it, a small handful of people will step out and act violently towards you, and they got their way. They took down monuments. And regardless of what you may think about the monuments in the Confederacy, the whole way in which this happened was not a deliberative process. And that is one of the upshots of this idea of liberty, of non-domination, is order and reason. And when the founders looked at the ancient democracies coming out of Greece, they saw them as very permissive. And I think the democracy, the way it's used today by the Democratic Party, is very permissive. Could be in the Republican Party too. But the founders,
but it's about as permissive as any mob rule arrangement you could.
And that's what it produces. The permissiveness will produce the mob rule.
Wow. So we have those four core civic republicanism principles, and then I was looking through some of the notes, and then that famous line, which and I will say this just as an aside. And I can see why, as we talk, there is actually a secular sacredness to what these gentlemen and how they assembled their views and put it into motion. So here's a republic, and it's not top down. You have the right to support or not support, or to shape or form or put yourself in a intellectual and spiritual crucible and produce a better result.
Yeah.
It's a republic if you can, and then we've seen if you will, and did you keep it?
Yeah.
But in the notes you mentioned that there was 13 other virtues that
yes, now these
that Franklin had.
Yeah, and all these are industry, work, cleanliness. I'm not going to have them all memorized. We could quickly grab them, but the big thing here is he's representing that intellectual thought of the founders that on the importance that virtue would play in preserving the republic. He's giving content to it. Madison will say it's that, but then we need checks and balances. We need other institutional separation of powers. We need that because when people get into these very powerful positions, their egos can take over. And also the idea of a representation, which is it makes it very different from the ancient democracies that were sort of direct democracy. The representation is not just in, say, a senator or a House member or even a president or a county supervisor, which is a lower magistrate in the mind of the founders. In effect, they are to represent, but you have the whole way the voting takes place to protect popular sovereignty, the electoral college, which people are trying to dismantle today. And that side of the party, they can never be direct democracy, but that I think is their ideal.
Well, it's their ideal to rule and ruin. I see that pattern quite clearly, and they don't care, and they won't care, and they are keenly interested in this following problem as I've determined it. When you study these things, you'll either be repelled or drawn, one of the two. And there's apathy and indifference, but we won't worry about that. But maybe we will, because The enduring problem, as I see it, is the narrative continues to be twisted, contaminated, and repudiated, and shown in a bad light, misrepresented. One of the greatest achievements of secular men was referring to a variety of beneficial spiritual inputs, and that they come up with a unique American republic. I mean, if I was to start a secular church, it would be the Church of the American Republic.
Mhm.
But the narrative of this, it's upside down. It's fascism. It's Hitlerism. Totally wrong, idiotic, actually, offensively in all dimensions. It's offensive in every way, and yet that continues. And
Yes.
you cannot beat the following maxim: is you can lie to people quickly, easily, effectively. You can probably never convince them that they have been lied to.
Yeah.
So this narrative that is, I guess, is couched in the media, the American media, the freedom of speech abuse, but nonetheless, freedom of speech. No one can change that except the individual, as far as I'm concerned.
All right.
You have to decide this is not true, and I got to find out what is.
Right.
I'm describing myself.
And you would hope that there would be true education. That as a student, I teach in secular schools as well as at Liberty. And I might say, when I teach at Liberty, I'm teaching philosophy. So my students there, I will say, hey, we have to think about the way in which we use the Bible as our critical, a source of our critical thinking. And we can't just, you're not just going to cite scripture.
Right.
I've been in public policy. I've worked for 4 presidents of the United States. It doesn't work. You're not going to go very far that way. What I try to add to folks in my ethics and public policy courses is a way to think ethically about this. Even that's a challenge to bring into the public, because a lot of folks, regardless of the party, they'd like to think, wow, ethics and morality, that's all very squishy. It's very, very difficult to get your hand on. Let's try to stay away from it. And I would say, no, that's the problem, because you can't really stay away from it. You think you can, but you're not really doing that.
So these are principles.
Yeah.
And principles, as a guest at one of our recent summits, maybe not so recent, he defined principle this way: is there rules that apply to everyone all the time?
And a principle would be regardless of the consequences in certain situations.
Yes. So, and then that invokes the notion of sacrifice. And
Yes.
so sacrifice, as Jordan Peterson pointed out in his We Who Struggle with God tour, which is a couple years ago, maybe.
Yeah.
And so I was privileged enough to have a good sense to take my wife and a friend of mine to go. And so he described it, and you'll see these clips occasionally on the internet, is that sacrifice is a contract with the future. It's a contract with your community. It's a contract with your nation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And the cost is up front. It's an investment.
And those people believe strongly in that.
Oh man. So I see that reflected in the commitment of some people that I've had a chance to meet, being involved with the Tea Party, being involved in governance on the election and party level, which is kind of mundane, but nonetheless, it's the most direct connection to the individual.
Well, I think the Tea Party, now you've been intimately involved with it, but they have a sense of Republican participation in your government. And it's a little unfortunate sometimes, folks the politician may not want to welcome that. That wasn't Madison. That wasn't Madison's view. That was Hamilton's view. Hamilton was the idea. I need you. I believe in popular sovereignty. I need you at the time of election, but then I'm going to go off and govern. And you guys kind of wait, till the next time the election comes around, and then I'll come back and sort of, I need you to get out the vote to get me back in. That's not the way Madison saw it. Madison said they'll split. He and Hamilton will split over this issue. They're together.
So then you'd have to modify Franklin's comment to a republic if you can trust someone else to keep it for you.
That would, but some people would say that's what government is, and that sort of picks out in a philosophical sense of the word liberalism, liberal polity, where the government is to protect the rights. In this case, life, liberty. We see that in the Declaration, so it's clearly a theme. I'm nuancing. I know that may not be all that much fun to an audience, but it is to an academic, and when you're really trying to understand. But because it helps sometimes understand why there is disagreement that there is, but Franklin was recognizing that, and that we have to be engaged. If we're not engaged in shaping the government on daily, and that was Madison. He wanted to form what he called the public opinion, which is the interaction between the representative, the nuance and distinctive nature of American Republic, and structurally is the representative. And the representative is the people that the representative brings sort of a rationality with more information to play, and they interact on the particulars of what's affecting me here, and that shapes an agreement, a public opinion, and that's the mandate that you go out and govern by. And the only person who's of late in a presidential election, was Trump. I've worked for 4 presidents. Trump is the only one that created a mandate for him to govern. And I only wish that the Republican Senate would help him govern.
But there was this protest about no kings, and he's not a king.
No, not even close.
But he does have he does have all the qualities of what would make a good human king if he was in fact so empowered. And so having the ability to influence and to persuade, which is really the only way that you keep the republic as a person, is that dialogue that you described. Do you know who your local representatives are?
Right.
When did you know last? Have you ever known?
Yeah.
Have you been to the State House and watched the votes and then heard how people presented their votes? Maybe it doesn't match up to what actually happened later. That requires that involvement. And we have this strange mix of cult of personality, I call it, where and I'm not saying he is, but we do have situations where we got some pretty bright people represented by outrageous buffoons. And we've got some pretty bright representatives who represent outrageous buffoons, the mix, and the confusion and the conflict with the media. I don't know how we get anywhere. It's amazing that we've made it. There's providence for you. It's amazing that we've made it to where we are, with this. So let me conclude our chat with this general question. Like I said, if I started a secular church, it would be the Church of the American Republic, because I think there's it's not arguably, there in fact is some deep sacred components to what made up the formulation and the enactment of the American Republic and the principles therein. So the question to conclude with is, you've studied it, you've taught it, you're intimately familiar with it, all of its dimensions. Where is it? How is it going to be relatable to who would hear this and not be familiar with it, if you will, or who has known and then forgotten and drifted away from? How do we get back on track? How far off track are we with these core principles that define what the Republic really is and needs to be, can be, and should be?
Well, I think one area that brings us back is a perpetual problem within the human condition is this prowess for unchecked power. And I think you were kind of describing that a moment ago. And if people are going to live together in society, they're going to have a set of principles. And a kind of a direct democracy or a permissive democracy is only going to perpetuate that power. They don't really have an end goal. They don't have a particular vision. Here, the vision is ultimately let's develop the character of the individual, allow those sort of cultural structures, religion, morality to be allowed in culture, and let's put whatever institutional structures we need to put in place so that we can be a people that are self-governing. And while the founders didn't talk about a minimal government, that notion actually follows from self-government. If you want a self-governing people, you're not going to want a big government that sort of says to everybody, here's what you do. You may not know when you've crossed the line, in terms of minimal government. What the founders are focused on, let's govern ourselves. Let's do what that's necessary, and let's keep in place certain limits. And if we need to reinforce those by institutions, separation of powers, representative government, electoral college, those things that we can put there, and then within that, we can operate within a civic virtue or developing our culture. Those are the things, because in the end, living in society is to deal with unchecked power.
Unchecked power. That's a scary and perfect place to leave it. Wow, because I often feel powerless.
Well,
what a shame.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I do want to say, as I straighten up in my chair, I really appreciate you taking the time, and I kind of envy you with your ability to and career oriented focus on this, because, well, then you get full of these things, and you're in a position to share them with alacrity and detail. So we touched on things. We didn't really investigate much deeply, but the conclusion is the summary is good. We have all the tools to improve ourselves and our nation, and we need to focus on unchecked power. And so, thank you for that.
And I thank you too for allowing me this opportunity. Again, we're celebrating the 250th year of the Declaration. What better way to do that than to go back and explore the distinctiveness and the uniqueness of Republican government, and then we can debate how far we're off the mark or whether we're on the mark.
It's almost like Josiah finding the book of the law. You know, yeah, I'm sure you're familiar with that story. Yeah. You know, young Josiah finds the book of the law, and he's just like, we really screwed up. Yeah. We got to get back on track. So looking forward to seeing the history unfold as it does every day with that. So, Scott, thank you again for joining us, and we got to talk again. There's more depth that we go in, and glad to have you back with that one.
Thank you. Happy to come back and chat anytime on anything I'm teaching on. It's always relevant to what you're interested in. Thank you.